country, when they're making direct investments, what is it that corporations look for? What is it that they look for in a country when they're shopping around? Well, first of all, let's see stability. Yes, they are looking for stability, but stability does not equal democracy, it does not equal a fair distribution of power, and it does not equal protection of the workers. Let's look at some of the most stable countries in the world, because I'd argue that France, for example, one with very excellent worker conditions and very excellent democratic principles, is not particularly stable and does not attract these sorts of investment, whereas plenty of investment is flowing to countries like Saudi Arabia that have huge concentrations of power and huge restrictions on the rights of workers and their access to defences. So we'd say that no, simply having this sort of interest in stability does not equal an interest in investing in countries that ensure good conditions for workers or ensure good developmental prospects. Let's look at the other things they look at. They look for things like cheap labour. And we'd say, well, where there exists cheap labour, there exist poor social conditions, because as long as you can maintain a never-ending cycle of poor social conditions, people will be so desperate for your jobs that they will accept any crappy conditions you offer them. And that is the sort of country that international corporations tend to shop around for. They're not looking for the sort of country that can offer them the most educated workforce, the workforce that is most aware of their opportunities. They're looking for the workforce that can't go anywhere else, and is always going to work for them and work hard for very little pay, because that's what leads to the greatest profit. So, ladies and gentlemen, we on the affirmative fundamentally reject that the interests of international corporations and the ideals that they look for when investing in a country line up with the developmental ideals that these countries and the international community needs these countries to achieve. So, no thank you. To take us back to this idea that we started at the beginning, we proposed an alternative. We proposed an alternative system that allows sovereign countries and national governments to escape the restrictions of an international economic market dependent entirely on the interests of these corporations. So, let's look at the three fundamental ideas that have been raised by this model. The first is, well, how do we ensure the flexibility that a sovereign government requires to adjust and to achieve development? The second is, how do we achieve the financial development in developing countries that the international community is looking for? And the third is, how do we best protect the interests of these workers? So on this first idea, well, frankly, I thought it was fairly ridiculous, and we've maintained this throughout our case tonight, that the negative ever stood up here and said that they were standing for flexibility, that they were offering countries the opportunity to choose whatever sorts of working standards they want, because surely that's the sort of flexibility that countries need. And we said, no. We said that the sort of flexibility that countries need is the flexibility to set their own tariffs, is the flexibility to set their own restrictions allowing them to decide what sort of operations happen in their country. The flexibility that the negative have proposed, the flexibility that they've discussed, is the flexibility to be exploited. The flexibility to be in a competitive cycle that means that you have to, I'll take you in a second, lower your standards continuously in order to appeal to a community of investors that are only interested in investing in countries with poor standards. Go ahead, Cameron.
You're splitting hairs. Where are you saying the difference is between, setting tariffs that control who can come in and who can't, and having flexible standards that allow people to come in or not come in? Where's the difference there?
There's no difference there, Cameron. I think you're misunderstanding me, because what I'm saying is that if you have a system where international organisations like the IMF and the WTO are not able to dictate explicitly to countries what their domestic policy with regards to tariffs and with regards to conditions should be, then a country has the power to set them however damn well they see fit. And that's quite important, because that means that then they're not subject to the whims of these corporations. They're not subject to a situation where they're having to compete with other countries to see who can provide the lowest standards, to see who can be the most open, who can be the most abject in their sort of begging to have these sorts of systems applied. We're not dictating that. We're allowing these countries to maintain the protections that they need, to maintain the standards that they need. So we on the Athens stood up for allowing sovereign countries and nations to have the flexibility that they need to provide for good developmental outcomes. So let's look at the second idea, which is how do we achieve financial development in developing countries? And well, frankly, I've already discussed this idea of that in the current system there exists a race to the bottom, because the incentives are all wrong. The incentives are for countries to completely remove the protections, and in fact we have a system that dictates that they must remove their protections. And what this means is that they perpetuate. No, thank you. They are perpetually locked into a cycle of poor standards. They're perpetually locked into a cycle where they're appealing to people who are only interested in investing in a country that does not allow for the development outcomes that we want. Go ahead, Cam.
Your whole case is on this basis that essentially NGOs have this, they can choose where they go. They have this incredible choice. They don't, Daniel. There's a certain tier of countries that is stable enough to allow for investment, and there's another tier that simply isn't. The stability factor is very important in dictating where NGOs actually invest.
Cameron, if it was true that there was only such a small pool of countries that people were interested in developing in, then we'd see, well, frankly, what we'd see is a system under which international corporations completely rejected a large number of countries, and frankly that's not what's actually happening in the world, and I think you're failing to understand the actual system that we have, where most countries experience foreign development of one sort or another. And I've already discussed the fact that stability does not actually equal the development that we want, so I'm going to try and move on from that point, because I don't think it was particularly coherent. So let's look at this thing, which is, well, does exposure always lead to good development? Because this is what the negative put forward. And we'll say, well, no, not all exposure equals development. Because just having this corporation inside your country does not mean that they're making the sorts of investments that are needed for your country to develop. They're not investing in the sorts of things that make a lasting impression on that country, that allow for that country to take the options such as having infrastructure development, such as having investment in education, such as having investment in the provision of services and welfare conditions that allow for people to become to have greater access to social development outcomes. It doesn't allow for that at all, because we see that the sorts of investments that are made simply lock people into a system where they are doing the most menial tasks, where they're doing the jobs that give them no opportunities in future. And while this meets some short-term need of the employees, it does not meet their need as citizens in the long term or as citizens of society, because it doesn't allow that society to ever develop. It simply shifts profits off to another country and locks the developing country into the boom and bust cycles of the international organizations that they're tied into. What we see is that we want to achieve some sort of independence from that. We want to see these countries being allowed to develop on their own. But let's look at this third idea, because frankly, the negative stood up and they said the job opportunities are always good. We're offering people choice. And we'd say, well, no, because frankly, protecting workers' interests is always good. Protecting their working conditions ensures that people will always be able to work in an environment where they are appreciated as people and where they are appreciated as employees. And this means that they will have a certain amount of standards, certain conditions that always exist, and this allows them to develop. This allows them to have an opportunity to increase their status as citizens within their country and within the international community, because it gives them access to certain rights. Certain rights like time for a good education, certain rights like not being forced to work when you're 10. And that is what we have stood up for on the affirmative, because we're proposing a system that achieves real development and sees a rejection of the last 40 years. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, what we've seen from the affirmative tonight is a model that is fundamentally opposed, firstly, to the rights of individual nations to decide their own future and to take their own decisions with regards to economic cooperation, but also to the prosperity, to the international benefits, both on a material scale and on the scale of ideas and ideologies that globalisation is bringing and has been bringing and we've wanted to continue to bring for some time into the future. So based on that, I'd say that I can split this debate into four basic themes, and these are the benefits that globalisation brings to individuals, the benefits that it brings on a national scale, thirdly the idea of international relations, and fourthly the idea of ethnic relations. Thank you, Chapman. So the first of these then, the benefit that globalisation brings to individuals. What is this benefit, ladies and gentlemen? Quite simply, it's employment. A corporation comes into a country, they're in there and they're offering jobs. Now, the affirmative have responded to this by asking, yeah, okay, they're offering jobs, but what is the actual nature of the jobs that they are offering? Well, ladies and gentlemen, yes, in a lot of these situations, the jobs that they are offering are not exactly the best jobs on the market. But we would propose, ladies and gentlemen, that no, thank you, Jeremy. That when we look at a place like China and we see that workers there have got jobs that, yes, might go for many hours in very bad factory conditions, but what we see is that these workers have access to food, water and the basic amenities of life because of the benefits that this employment brings them. And that this is a step up, indeed several steps up, from the situation that we see in countries like Ethiopia, which is completely cut off from the West, completely, and doesn't allow anyone in, and where therefore we see people starving and dying because they can't get any jobs at all, and so they can't even have access to the basic necessities that an international corporation could in fact bring them by way of this employment. Yes, Jeremy?
I know it's a bit late at third, Rob, but can you tell us what the harms of our model are in regards to instituting environmental and worker standards in the third world?
The harms of your model, Jeremy, are many and varied. So, Jeremy, we would argue that under the current system, under the system which the IMF and the WTO is currently running, something that you're very opposed to, we know, we would say that we are able to bring corporations coming in and offer employment to these individuals, and we would say that under your model, where we will see the kind of restrictions imposed that do not allow the kind of economic freedom from these international corporations that we see under the status quo, we would say that under this system, we are going to see the kind of detriments to individuals of the kind that I was talking about just there. Back to this point, the idea of the race to the bottom is another argument that the affirmative have brought up against this idea of individual employment, that the individual employment in question will be in very bad conditions because we have companies competing to hit the lowest standard possible. But ladies and gentlemen, as we have talked to you about throughout tonight's debate, these companies actually do have a vested interest in providing good conditions for their workers, because if there is sufficient competition in the market, which there will be if globalisation occurs to the extent that we're talking about in this debate, then what the result of this competition is that if conditions are sufficiently bad in a particular workplace, workers can actually leave and go elsewhere. And so the company has an incentive to keep their standards at a reasonable level so as to maintain their workers. They actually have an incentive to improve, and Cameron gave us an example of this in the Sony and Panasonic institutions in Mexico, where we've seen a huge improvement in working conditions simply because they realize that there is an incentive there to provide good conditions for their workers, otherwise the company will suffer. It is in the interest of the company to maintain this. To the second of these themes, the benefits on a national level. The affirmative have been very keen tonight to protect these nations from having the will of the West imposed on them. But ladies and gentlemen, we would say that under the current system, things are actually working pretty well in this regard, because what globalisation essentially means is that a nation can have the choice of whatever company it wishes to invite into its country, the basic economic freedom to choose whatever economic relations they wish to set up. And we would argue that the IMF and the WTO encourage the sovereignty of these nations in this way, simply by aiding and abetting these basic economic freedoms. No, thank you. And so they lead to greater flexibility. And ladies and gentlemen, flexibility can only lead to improvement, because flexibility means that a country is able to make its own decisions, is able to invite whatever corporations it wishes. No, thank you. And will not be subject then to the whims of the corporation, simply because it has the freedom of choice necessary to protect themselves from this kind of exploitation. No, thank you. To the third major point, the idea of international relations, which is a conglomeration, no thank you, of several different ideas we've seen in tonight's debate. One of the fundamental results of globalisation is an exchange of ideas between the first, second and third worlds. And this occurs not only on a governmental level, where we see better international ties between nations because of the links that corporations forge, but also most significantly on an individual level. Because what corporations do when they invest in a country is they bring in infrastructure, and this leads to things like media, the internet, closer ties to Western culture, and the resultant spread of ideas. Shelley gave us a wonderful example of this in prep by saying that Bollywood movies are now becoming more like Hollywood movies. And this leads to, firstly, it leads to the spread of democracy and the spread of ideals of freedom and liberal thought, which essentially frees up people's thinking. Cameron talked about this at first, and then leads to better freedom of individual thinking and democratic ideas throughout the world. But also, secondly, it leads to a more general spread of ideas, innovations, forward thinking, and this leads to a more progressive spirit worldwide, which will ultimately help these countries after all, because it leads to economic innovation and the like. But furthermore, this international relations point also works in the manner of in that globalization actually provides an incentive for the governments of these countries not to go around doing crazy things all the time, because believe it or not, these corporations actually choose what countries they invest in very carefully, and they make sure that they are not going to invest in countries where the governments are dictatorial regimes that result in things like instability. we see then that countries like Somalia or whatever do not have foreign companies invested in them. No, thank you. And so there's an incentive then for governments to act in a rational and sensible way, because if they don't, then foreign companies are not likely to want to invest in them. So what it means then is that it's good for peace and good for international cooperation. Finally, to the fourth of these points, which is ethnic relations. I know it's a side issue, but I put it as a point on its own just because it's so random. Firstly, this is the idea that globalization leads to stratification of ethnic minorities and so on in third world countries. I didn't really understand the point, but I'll talk about it anyway. Firstly, we would say that money does not know and does not care what race you are. So fundamentally, globalization will lead to economic growth and is going to lift the standards in any case, because it will remove global race barriers. But more significantly, we say that especially in the economically desperate situations of third world companies, people cannot afford, employers cannot afford to specialize by race, because that's fundamentally puts them at a disadvantage. It is economically disadvantageous to be racist because it puts them on a lower level than the institutions that they compete against. And further on another level, we'd say that more jobs in these countries means a higher level of economic prosperity, means less poverty, less tension, less people on the streets, less riots, and thus less danger of race conflict in any case. And for all those reasons, ladies and gentlemen, that is why we take to oppose.
Well, I think I can sum up our whole team's case tonight as if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys argument. And that's what we're saying here. In the companies, in whatever industry they're in these days, depend on not just being able to pay the lowest wages they can, they also depend on finding intelligent, dynamic workers wherever they can. And they can't just go out and splash around money for workers that don't know what they're doing and that don't have an education